close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. On we'll go. Along the way, melodies we haven't played. No, I don't want no rest. Echoing around these walls, fighting to create a song. I don't wanna miss a beat. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. On we'll go. Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. On we'll go. till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands.
Okay, here we are. Let's get started. Sorry about the long opening. I've been doing that lately. Don't know why. Just can't get my shit together right at the beginning of a stream lately for some reason. So, we'll get into some more of the 48 liberal lies you were probably about American history you were probably taught in school. I don't remember where we're at, but we've been doing roughly 3 or 4 per session. And we are... bring my hands up here so you know what I'm doing. I'm not doing something weird under the table. Just trying to clean the glasses. I looked up and saw what it looked like. I'm like, oh, I shouldn't do that. All right. So we are on 31. So we're only, what? An ad starts in 3 minutes already? I gotta see if I can fix that. I don't like it starting that soon after we start the stream. But anyway, well, we'll deal with it. So the first one here is barely 3 pages. It is lie number 31. Muslim terrorists are poor and uneducated and hate us because we support Israel. Well, there might be some truth to that. Hating us because we support Israel anyway, especially right now. All this Hamas crap. All right, so I'll read the 4 quotes. I have 6 root causes for terrorism and poverty is the main factor. That's by Bill Christensen, former CIA director in the Washington Post, April 10th, 2002. Second is Poverty is a Cause of Terrorism by Bob Carr, New South Wales Iraq Appeal, June 8th, 2003. The third, 19 hijackers died in the suicide attacks. All were from the Middle East. 12 were from the underdeveloped, highly tribal southwestern provinces of Saudi Arabia. That's by David E. Harrell et al., Unto a Good Land. And then finally, they originate because of the vast global iniquities in which terrorism is ultimately rooted. And that's by Barbara Ehrenreich, Village Voice, October 9th, 2001. I don't believe poverty has anything to do with it, but anyway, we'll jump into it. We've got just under a minute before the ad starts. When Bob Carr, premier of the New South Wales, said, quote, the Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden and others like him get their support because they call on people who are living in poverty in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere, and that people turn to terrorism because they live in despair, end quote. He reflected a popular analysis of the root cause of terrorism. Surprisingly, even President George W. Bush said, oh, thank you for the follow, said, quote, we fight against poverty because hope is an answer to terror, end quote. And we're just a couple seconds from the ad, so I will stop there and have a sip of my margarita. I don't know how long the ad will go. It usually takes it a few seconds to actually say the ad is starting. So I don't know. Are we going to go into an ad? Are we in an ad? I can't see on my end. And since I'm reading, you don't see an ad? Okay. I had the note that said it was starting. So, all right, well. So the quote from GW is, "We fight against poverty because hope is an answer to terror." And Bill Clinton's economic advisor, Laura Tyson, said, quote, "We live in a world of unprecedented opulence and remarkable..." Oh, now it says we're in an ad. It finally started. I don't know why it has such a long pause in between. Uh-oh. Oh, okay. I thought I locked up there for a second. I was watching it and I can't... I'm getting a lot of lag on it. Okay. So now we're in an ad. And we're 15 seconds from the end. Almost there. Okay, it's over on your end. Okay. All right, so Bill Clinton's economic advisor, Laura Tyson, said, quote, "We live in a world of unprecedented opulence and remarkable deprivation, a world so interconnected that poverty and despair in a remote region can harbor a network of terrorism," end quote. A Dutch scholar claims, quote, "A range of social welfare politics will on balance reduce preferences for terrorism by reducing economic insecurity, religious political extremism, income inequality, and poverty," end quote. There is a reason so many people want to believe that the Muslim terrorists who attacked the United States on 9/11 and those who have engaged in bombings in Spain, Britain, Indonesia, and elsewhere do so because they are quote-unquote downtrodden or uneducated or frustrated with their material conditions. The reason so many desperately want to believe this is that the alternative is difficult to embrace, that some element in Islam itself is directing these terrorists, and that, in fact, they may really believe that the Quran says they should kill all infidels, which it does. Of course, the truth is that few, if any, of the Islamic terrorists have acted because of their dire material circumstances. The Dutch study accepted most research has found no evidence of a link between poverty and terrorism. Alberto Abadi, for example, working for the National Bureau of Economic Research, found that the risk of terrorism was not significantly higher for poorer countries, and that a nation's level of political freedom is a more important factor. Alan Kruger and Jitka Malekova, writing in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, concluded, quote, "There was little reason for optimism that a reduction in poverty or an increase in educational attainment would meaningfully reduce international terrorism," end quote. When one examines the individual murderers and terrorists, a picture of affluent, educated Middle Easterners emerges. Sayyid Qutb, the generally accepted founder of the radical Islamic movement, quote, "held a comfortable post as supervisor in the Ministry of Education in Egypt and was in the mainstream of the vast bureaucratic middle class," end quote. Like most of the radical Islamists, he was supremely threatened by sex. His experiences in Greeley, Colorado, at Northern Colorado University in 1949, hardly a time when women's lib, quote unquote, was in full bloom, terrified him about sexual mixing, quote unquote. His repulsion peaked when he attended a dance where, quote, naked legs filled the hall, arms draped around waists, chests met chests, lips met lips, and the atmosphere was full of love, end quote. God forbid we have an atmosphere of love. His eventual successor in the radical movement and Osama bin Laden's perpetual sidekick, Ayman al-Zawahiri, likewise, quote, grew up in a quiet middle-class suburb of Cairo, end quote. His father was a doctor who... What's that? Oh, I got another follower. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Ah, and that put me over my 200 followers. That was my goal, and I have finally attained it. It only took almost 2 years, but I got there. All right. First time chat. Let's see. Hello, sorry for bothering you. Want to offer a promotion? No. I don't do the paid promotions. Ain't gonna do it. Okay. Let's see. So, Zawahiri grew up in a quiet middle-class suburb. His father was a doctor who, along with his mother, came from one of the most prominent families in Egypt. Zawahiri was well educated, attending medical school. Osama bin Laden's background is well known. He came from a wealthy family whose riches came from construction projects obtained through ties to the King of Saudi Arabia. Richard Miniter points out the notion that Osama bin Laden could finance terror entirely out of some quote-unquote vast fortune is a myth. It is true that from 1970 to about 1994, he had some $24 million flow through his hands, although much of that was for his father's construction company with which he worked. Mark Seligman studied some 400 terrorists and found that an astonishing 75% came from the middle class and two-thirds had a college education. Nasra Hasran's study of Palestinian terrorists found similar characteristics. Quote, none of them were uneducated, desperately poor, simple-minded, or depressed. Many were middle class. 2 were the sons of millionaires, end quote. In a recent study of 149 suicide bombers in Iraq, more than 50 came from wealthy Saudi Arabia, more than 3 times the number who came from Iraq, which was 16. 8 came from Syria and 7 from Kuwait. One of the few bombers Newsweek profiled was a teacher, another a college student. In 2007, the 2007 plot to detonate multiple car bombs in England was planned and was attempted, until it was foiled, by 6 doctors, a medical student, and a lab technician. One of them was a neurosurgeon. The London Times reported that a senior al-Qaeda figure in Iraq warned a British cleric in April that attacks were on the way, saying, quote, those who cure you will kill you, end quote. After studying 350 Latin American, European, and Middle Eastern terrorists, Charles Russell and Bowman Miller observed that 2/3 came from quote-unquote middle or upper classes, and that the quote vast majority were quite well educated, end quote. Reuven Paz, an Israeli researcher, looked at 154 Arab terrorists killed in Iraq in 2004 and found many were married, had good educations, and came from wealthy Saudi families. Interestingly, individual wackos such as Unabomber Ted Kaczynski are exceptions to the rule. Quote, while terrorism is a profoundly antisocial activity, from the terrorist's point of view, it is also a highly social one. It is carried out by groups that don't tolerate sociopaths, end quote. Far from being quote-unquote deranged loners, 73% of the terrorists are married, and Sageman, found that kinship was a factor in some 14% of the networks, including the family of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, which helped orchestrate the 9/11 attacks. The Hamburg cell that carried out the 9/11 attacks were all, quote, alienated and friendless until they united, end quote. Indeed, Seligman's study found that 88% of the terrorists were related or were connected by marriage or friendship to other terrorists. Michael Bond, surveying the evidence, noted the terrorists were, quote, no worse educated, no poorer, and no more religious than anyone else, end quote. The one flaw in the research is that it neglects to show that while most studies correctly note Muslim terrorists are not particularly religious before they become terrorists, one of the main factors causing them to bond was renewed Islamic vigor. Many of the 9/11 hijackers, for example, were attracted to the stricter lifestyle touted by Mohammed Atta, although few, in fact, followed it at all. Just days before they hijacked the airplanes and killed thousands of people, they were visiting strip bars in Florida. Whether it is a suppressed sexual anxiety or pure religious fanaticism that drives the terrorists, it is fairly certain at this point that poverty plays no role in their pathology. And that is the end of that one. Like I said, it was barely 3 pages. So I think definitely the part he said it, but he minimized it. I think is the there don't even have to be extremists within Islam to become terrorists or suicide bombers, or it seems to be something within that religion that really drives them to it. Oh no, I'm a terrible Islamophobe. Fuck off. Okay, so lie 32. The news media is objective, fair, and balanced, and always has been. Okay, so this was about 5 pages. All right. So there's one quote here. Look, Bernie, Bernard Goldberg, of course there's a liberal bias in the news. All the networks tilt left. That's by Andrew Hayward, executive producer, CBS News in 1993. Quoted in Bernard Goldberg, Bias, a CBS insider exposes how the media distort the news. Okay, so I admit there is not a history textbook that flatly says this, but it's a pretty common myth, and one perpetuated by the mainstream media every day. Many adult Americans grew up in the age of Huntley and Brinkley, Walter Cronkite, or even Edward R. Murrow, all of whom were viewed as objective or fair, but none of whom really were. However, the difference between them and the modern television news people is that they at least were good actors and concealed their true partisan colors. Certainly their own views helped shape what was covered, and in the case of Murrow, his famous slime attack against Joseph McCarthy was overt, as was Cronkite's disgust with the Vietnam War. Nevertheless, Americans, by and large, trusted news organizations to provide reasonably accurate and generally honest reports of the day's events. In fact, this approach to fact-based news only dated back to the American Civil War. Prior to that time, all news was partisan or motivated solely by the goal of electing a certain party's candidates. It might come as a shock, but almost none of the antebellum papers were interested in making money. There were only a handful of newspapers that depended on circulation to stay alive, such as James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald or Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. These were by far the exceptions. From the time of the Revolution until the 1820s, American papers, always with some exceptions, tended to be focused heavily on local news and were somewhat impartial. Certainly some papers were Jeffersonian and others were Federalist, and their rhetoric could get heated. Parties themselves, however, did not directly fund or control most papers. That changed drastically when Martin Van Buren conceived of a new political party based on patronage, the Jacksonians or Jacksonian Democrats, later just Democrats. He knew that getting out the vote was the key to victory at the polls. A number of structural political reforms made this possible, eliminating property requirements for voters, national conventions for candidates, and demise of King Caucus, the practice before Andrew Jackson's time of having all candidates selected by small groups of influential citizens in the caucus. But in the end, propaganda in its purest form was needed. Van Buren intended to supply it. Jacksonians bought newspapers, installed their own men as editors, and the papers became no more than propaganda agencies, as one historian labeled them. No editor was more loyal to the Democratic cause than Duff Green with his United States Telegraph. Green's Telegraph flatly condemned neutrality as an absence of principles, and overall, editors increasingly inserted their points of view into papers. Green obediently repaid his political masters with pro-Jackson editorials and obligingly turned out a special extra paper during the 1828 election with a circulation of 40,000. Green was not alone in his view that objectivity was to be avoided. A Louisville paper criticized an Indiana paper for its neutrality, noting, quote, "In this state, people have more respect for an open, independent adversary than for dumb partisans who are too imbecile to form an opinion." End quote. One Jacksonian editor noted that, quote, "We most of all abhor and detest a neutral paper. It pretends to be all things to all men." End quote. This attitude has been confirmed in studies of the content in which the percentage of editorial comment in news stories increased, then nearly doubled between 1848 and 1860. Many editors owed their jobs directly and specifically to the Jacksonians, frequently slipping back and forth between editor positions and postmaster jobs. Jackson himself appointed numerous editors to salaried political positions, including many postmasters, while nationally it is estimated that 50 to 60 editors had been given plum political jobs. Gerald Baldusty found that in 1830, the state of Georgia had 11 newspapers, quote, "all of them embroiled in political fights," end quote, and the party had at least 3 patronage papers in each state, with the Globe serving as their pilot for editorial policy. By 1850, political bias so dominated the newspaper industry that the U.S. Census estimated nearly 80% of American papers were partisan, while other estimates put the number of partisan papers at close to 100%. Van Buren's program was devastatingly successful in winning elections, but none of the newspapers could sustain themselves on the basis of their news. Publishers carried delinquent customers for months, their deficits offset through political contributions, loans, and subsidies from the U.S. Congress. Richard John, a historian of the postal system, concluded that the subsidization of newspapers through the public mails constituted an important economic bias for favoring the transmission of less thoughtful, considered, and shorter newspapers at the expense of books which were longer and more costly. By the 1830s, quote, "the news made up roughly 95% of the total messages," end quote, and equaled the number of letters that passed through an average post office. And since more than half of that news was stridently partisan, one could infer that by the 1830s, partisan propaganda constituted almost half of all postal deliveries. The Civil War brought radical change. People wanted to know if their sons, brothers, and fathers were fighting, and if they won or lost, and most important, if they had been killed. Papers published casualty lists, and within the 4-year course of the war, most major papers adopted the, quote, "inverted pyramid," end quote, style of reporting in which the most important facts and only facts were presented first and the least important last. Virtually overnight, editors abandoned the partisan approach to papers and adopted the objective, fact-based approach. Quote, facts, facts, nothing but facts, end quote, said one editor. Quote, so many peas at so much a peck, so much molasses at so much a quart, end quote. While the war was the single greatest factor affecting the transformation of the press, business demands played a role. Increasingly, papers relied less on party subsidies and had to survive on their own circulations, and that in turn brought an unwillingness to alienate up to half of the consumers who might identify with the opposing political party. Comments by editors starkly contrasted with the sentiments offered by Duff Green and other partisan editors. Lawrence Gobright, the AP's Washington agent, concluded, quote, my business is merely to communicate facts. My instructions do not allow me to make any comments upon the facts which I communicate. My dispatches are merely dry matters of facts and detail, end quote. The share of objective or non-biased papers in circulation rose to more than 66% by 1900, while stories labeled by journalism researchers as biased declined especially sharply after 1872. In 1922, the American Society of Newspaper Editors adopted the quote-unquote canons of journalism, which embraced the objective position by stating that the, quote, primary purpose of gathering and distributing news and opinion is to serve the general welfare by informing the people and enabling them to make judgments on the issues, end quote. Article 4 said that, quote, every effort must be made to assure that the news content is accurate, free from bias, and in context, and that all sides are presented fairly, end quote. Editor and Publisher magazine boasted that the new standards would eliminate the quote-unquote typhoid berries of journalism. Likewise, the Associated Press's quote, managing editor's code of ethics, end quote, reflected similar concerns with fairness, accuracy, and truth-telling. Then we've got 3 bullet points here. 1. The good newspaper is fair, accurate, honest, responsible, independent, and decent. 2. Truth is its guiding principle. 3. It avoids practices that would conflict with the ability to report and present news in a fair, accurate, and unbiased manner. Veteran reporter Lou Guzzo recalled about the 1950s, quote, when a reporter on any beat dared fracture the barrier of objective reporting, his copy was tossed back to him for immediate revision, end quote. No city editor he worked for, quote, tolerated even the slightest hint of bias in news reporting, end quote, Guzzo noted, and the, quote, the newspaper itself espoused so subtle an editorial stance that virtually no one could state with authority that the Cleveland Plain Dealer editorial board or the staff was conservative, liberal, or whatever, end quote. Modern historians and journalists have sneered at the attempt at objectivity, calling the reporters little more than quote-unquote note-takers. But in fact, the papers began to slowly change during the New Deal era. Franklin D. Roosevelt, detested by many editors, was fawned over by reporters who helped him revise his numerous lies about a quote-unquote personal friend. In a specific situation, the friend and the situation always changed. As Burton Folsom points out, the press overwhelmingly cooperated with FDR. In an effort to portray him as a healthy man, the press never showed him in his wheelchair. Some reporters were even drafted to help design New Deal policy. They also ignored his cheating on Eleanor. He gave reporters and editors private meetings, jobs in his administration, and government loans. For the most part, the press remained nonpartisan until 1960, when, for a variety of reasons, reporting began to turn rapidly leftward. A shift that occurred well before the Vietnam War. While still maintaining a pretense of objectivity and fairness, reporters, editors, and television news anchors began to steadily slant the news. They repeatedly proclaimed their objectivity, yet survey after survey has shown that the media voted overwhelmingly Democratic in every election since 1970, and the percentages weren't even close. A Roper poll, for example, found that 91% of journalists surveyed voted for Bill Clinton in 1992. The public saw the press as liberally biased as well. An October 2003 Gallup poll found that 45% of Americans said the news media was too liberal, while only 14% said it was too conservative. Although denied by nearly every influential journalist in the mainstream media, the press is biased, badly slanted to the left. This is not opinion. This is the result of countless scholarly studies in Journalism, History and Journalism, and Mass Communication Quarterly, among others. Period. Journalism scholar Jim Kuipers in 2002, surveying several press treatments of volatile public issues, found, quote, "There is a demonstrable liberal bias to the mainstream press in America," end quote. As Stuart Garner, CEO of Thomson Newspapers, Inc., candidly admitted, most modern reporters, quote, "want to save the world whether the world wants to be saved or not," end quote. Whereas Joseph Pulitzer's motto was accuracy, 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 Jack Fuller, president of the Tribune Publishing Company, observed, quote, "Journalism's unacknowledged shame is how often it fails to live up to Pulitzer's standard, even with respect to the most commonplace details," end quote. Is it any wonder that a June 2000 Gallup poll rating the top 10 confidence-inspiring institutions put the military at the top, named by 64% of the respondents, followed by the church, 56%, police, 54%, the Supreme Court, 47%, the presidency, 42%. Newspapers and television's news ranked number 9 and 10, respectively, with only 37 and 36% of respondents saying they had great or even some confidence in those institutions. Perhaps the lack of confidence stems from the fact that the major newspapers and television news outlets don't even try to improve. The Media Research Center maintains a website documenting bias in the 2004 elections, and coverage of the 2008 primaries suggests nothing has changed. And that is the end of that one. That's interesting. I didn't know that there was a shift just during the Civil War that made them actually start to be as unbiased as possible. That's very interesting. I've never heard that. Okay, this one's a little bit longer by a page. Okay, we're still going to do 4 tonight. So lie number 33. Native Americans were great environmentalists while white settlers destroyed the buffalo. Boy, do we get to hear that all the time now. Take a few sips here. All right. So we start off with 2 quotes. The changes that produced in some areas were nearly as cataclysmic as those that occurred during the Ice Age. Having killed off the giant herds, ranchers and farmers quickly shifted to cattle. That's by John Mack Faragher et al. Out of Many. The second one is, there is the assumption that Native Americans were either poor, primitive, starving savages whose numbers were too low to have any impact on the pristine landscape, or that Native peoples were children of nature and original conservationists who were too wise to overuse their environment. That's by Charles E. Kay, Aboriginal Overkill and Native Burning, 1995. Leave it to Hollywood to come up with the classic image that stands history on its head. No one better illustrated the power of the visual image to send a wrong message than the crying Indian, Iron Eyes Cody, who was featured in Keep America Beautiful's 1979 public service ad, quote, "People start pollution, people can stop it," end quote. Although Earth Day, first observed on March 21, 1971, officially touched off the environmental or ecology movement in the United States, this famous ad firmly ensconced it. In the ad, we see an Indian paddle his canoe up a polluted stream as smokestacks belch their black soot into the blue sky. Then he walks to the top of a hill where one expects to see a glorious western landscape, only to find a highway and, the coup de grace, a car speed by, whereupon the passengers throw a bag of trash out the window that lands at the Indian's feet. The camera pans to his face, at which point a single tear streams down his cheek. Given Hollywood's affinity for the phony, it was predictable that the tear was glycerin, and the Indian was an Italian named Aspera de Corti, born in 1904 in Kaplan, Louisiana, to a family of Sicilian immigrants. De Corti became an actor, and while he wasn't an Indian in real life, he played one on television and in the movies many times, appearing in over 100 television shows or films. That I did not know. I had no idea. I thought he was a real Indian. Go figure. And I know that ad. I've seen it 1,000 times in my life. The crying Indian cemented in the minds of many Americans a long-held myth that the Native Americans were somehow superior to all other settlers, particularly Europeans. This myth began with the Thanksgiving story, where the English had to be saved by the Indians, then reached full bloom with the near destruction of the massive bison herds on the western plains, supposedly all at the hands of the white man. It is incontestable that white hunters, particularly those gathering meat for the railroads, decimated the buffalo herds. The introduction of the horse by whites changed the life of the Plains Indians, who, up to that time, had largely been farmers. Suddenly mobile, the Plains Indians found that hunting buffalo was relatively easy, and the Plains tribes shifted from a farming-gathering economy to a nomadic lifestyle. As Princeton professor Andrew Eisenberg put it, quote, "The nomadic Indians of the Western Plains abandoned their ecological safety nets in order to concentrate year-round on bison hunting," end quote. And although Spaniards had introduced the horse to Mexico, it was other Indian tribes that brought the horse to the Cheyenne and Sioux, two of the foremost buffalo hunting tribes. Buffalo herds were vast, but by almost any account. Thomas Farnham watched a single herd cross his line of sight for 3 days in 1839, while in 1871 Colonel Richard Dodge wrote that, quote, "The whole country appeared to be one mass of buffalo," end quote. Yet, as Eisenberg, Brown anthropologist Shepard Kretsch III, and Dan Flores, a historian at the University of Montana, all note, the Indians had hunted bison, although less effectively, before the horse, using techniques such as surrounding the herds, driving them off cliffs, and setting fire to entire prairie areas to wipe out the whole herd. The French word brûler, or burnt, brûler, like creme brulee, or burnt, referred to the Sikangu, burnt thigh, Sioux division, whose survivors of hunting fires had burns on their legs. Charles Mackenzie, traveling the plains in 1804, observed entire herds charred from Indian fires. The quote-unquote buffalo jump was a more risky technique that required an Indian dressed in a buffalo skin to lure a herd to a cliff where he'd leap to a small ledge while the animals careened over the side to their deaths. Okay, then we have a picture. I think it's the only one in the article. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and read the caption and show it. This is that Corty. Esper de Corty, the Crying Indian, was used in a Keep America Beautiful campaign in the 1970s that implied that modern capitalism and industrialism were the cause of pollution and waste, and in contrast, the Indians were great environmentalists. But de Corty was not an Indian, and the Native Americans were already on a path to exterminate the buffalo before the white hunters accelerated the process. So here is the picture. For those of you not familiar with de Corty, come on, there he is. There's our Crying Indian, the Sicilian. Okay. So, getting back to the main text. Nor were all Indians natural conservationists to the point that they used quote-unquote all parts of the buffalo. Many travelers reported herds of bison carcasses rotting in the sun with only a hump or tail removed. Father Pierre Desmet watched some 3,000 Assiniboine Indians surround a herd of 600, wiping out every one. Some estimates made in the 1850s suggest that Indians harvested about 450,000 animals a year, and some think the number was much higher. The stench permeated the prairie for miles, and many pioneers came across carcasses of buffalo killed by the Indians. But it was not just buffalo. Kretsch details the Indians' destruction of the white-tailed deer herds, and ironically, the English government's attempt to protect the herds as early as 1760. Charles Kay has demonstrated that the Indians not only overhunted, but by their actions they drove herds into quote-unquote, quote, it's a longer one, quote, long-distance migrations where they were able to outdistance most of their human carnivorous predators, end quote. Some scholars have still sought to place the blame on the Europeans. Charles Kay, Andrew Eisenberg, and Dan Flores all reject this view, as does Shepard Kretsch, who summarizes the leftist position nicely. The Indians, quote, were seduced by new technology and alcohol. Corrupted, they were left at the mercy of the boundless greed of the European merchant capitalist, stripped of free will and agency, transformed into a monolithic forest proletariat, end quote. Of course, using the words Indians and proletariat in the same paragraph ought to immediately disqualify any professional historian from further publishing. Kretsch does not subscribe to the leftist position. Let's be clear. There is no doubt from any quarter that it was white hunters who polished off most of the buffalo herds, mainly because of their technological lead over the Indians. Armed with long-range, high-caliber hunting rifles, sharpshooters such as Buffalo Bill Cody could take down hundreds of animals in a single day. The commercialization of hides and buffalo meat placed further incentives on killing as many bison as possible. In the 1890s, the leather industry in the United States had grown to an $8.6 million business, with many of the hides coming from buffalo. Buffalo bones used for fertilizer and pigments filled 5,000 boxcars annually. Tales of the deadly effectiveness of the plains hunters, such as Cody, are renowned. Working from a stand in which the lead buffalo were shot at long range so as not to panic the herd, a good hunter could kill 10 to 50 animals and skin them in a single morning's work. One warehouse would hold 60 to 80,000 hides, and the number of hides shipped on the Union Pacific alone exceeded 1.3 million between 1872 and 1874. If, however, the whites accelerated the destruction of the buffalo, the work of Eisenberg, Kretsch, and others demonstrate without question that the Indians were already on the path to exterminating the bison at a somewhat slower level. When placed in the natural population constraints of fire and other predators, and then measuring the supporting power of the lands in which they existed, the buffalo were doomed eventually no matter what the whites did. Making matters worse, most Indians thought bison had some supernatural origin and were limitless. Some Indians believed the buffalo came from a lake in Canada. Quote, "You say they are all gone, but look, they come again and again to us. We cannot kill them all. They are there under that lake." End quote. Moreover, in the 19th century, the Plains Indians' lack of a market economy or system of surplus accumulation made them utterly dependent on trade with the Europeans. No comment more starkly differentiated the Indian and European concepts of economy than one made by John McDougall, who said of the Blackfeet in 1865, quote, "Without the buffalo they would be helpless, and yet the whole Blackfoot nation did not own one." End quote. Put another way, Eisenberg argues, quote, "Even had they recognized a decline, the inherent instability of the nomadic societies made it difficult always to enforce the mandates against waste." End quote. Moreover, as Kay notes, the impact of Indian hunting, burning, and clear-cutting on the forests was significant. Quote, "The idea that North America was a wilderness untouched by the hand of man prior to 1492 is a myth." End quote. Indeed, it was precisely this market-oriented philosophy that saved the buffalo. Hold on. Yeah, okay. Early government attempts to save the buffalo proved contradictory. One bill, for example, made it unlawful for non-Indians to kill buffalo, while the War Department viewed the removal of the buffalo as necessary for eliminating the hostiles' food source. By 1872, Yellowstone National Park provided the only public refuge for the bison outside of a few zoos. Yet, as Andrew Eisenberg notes, quote, "This remnant herd and other scattered survivors might eventually have perished as well had it not been for the efforts of a handful of Americans and Canadians. These advocates of preservation were primarily Western ranchers who speculated that ownership of the few remaining bison could be profitable, and elite Easterners possessed of a nostalgic urge to recreate the frontier." End quote. The American Bison Society, formed in 1905, whose members had almost exclusively come from the Northeast, and many had never seen a buffalo in person, sought to preserve the herds. J.P. Morgan, the banker who saved the railroads, also saved the buffalo by establishing a 20,000-acre tract in Colorado that he stocked with bison. Farmers bred cattle and cattle/bison hybrids called beefalo and sold the meat. Buffalo Bill's own Wild West show deliberately included mock buffalo hunts to expose the beautiful animals to the eastern whites. Touring the United States and Europe from the 1880s to 1913, Cody introduced the buffalo to millions of people, many of whom supported the American Bison Society. Perhaps the most significant action, however, came from Western ranchers such as Charles Goodnight, who captured buffalo calves in 1878 and developed his own private bison herd. In the early 1900s, Goodnight shipped almost 700 privately raised and protected buffalo to Canada's Wood Buffalo National Park. That herd grew to 14,000 by the mid-20th century. Ironically, many of the government herds were derived from animals purchased or donated from the private ranchers' herds. Other ranchers raised buffalo for multiple purposes, including hunting. One advertised, quote, "We supply buffalo for zoos, parks, circuses, and barbecues." End quote. The American Bison Society even referred customers who wanted to adopt a buffalo to ranchers, not the government. One Michigan Game Reserve was established by purchasing the private herd of Joshua Hill. Virtually all of the Yellowstone herd was rejuvenated in 1902 under the new game warden Charles Jesse Buffalo Jones. It came from two private herds. A government employee, Jones was credited with helping to restore the herds and did so to a large extent by using the private sector. His product, he rightly understood, consisted of the herd itself in its natural surroundings. Therefore, Jones located his bison corrals near the Mammoth Hot Springs, which was the park's busiest entrance, allowing a private souvenir shop to be set up. After he resigned, the new management wisely kept herds near the hot springs. The private sector saved many other species that would have been doomed under government protection. Quote unquote. California's Tule elk, a miniature species of elk, were rescued from extinction by a rancher, Henry Miller. Animals that he shipped from his private reserve to the government did not survive, except for a few that ended up at Yosemite. But Walter Dow, a California businessman, thought the elk could do well in the Owens Valley. Making crates for shipping the elk himself, he personally supervised the transfer in 1933. Ultimately, on government land, the herd dwindled back down to under 300, whereas it had thrived and grown in private hands. Equally amazing is the story of the Y.O. Ranch in Texas. Its wildlife hunting catalog includes wildebeest, gazelles, oryx, ibex, sable antelopes, kudu, and zebra. More than 50 exotic game species are available to hunt, yet the ranch, whose income partly depends on hunting, ensures the growth and preservation of these animals. So much so that there are, quote, more scimitar-horned oryx on the private game ranches in Texas than in their native territories in Africa, where they are under government protection, end quote. It also has more black buck antelope than exist in all their native lands in India and Pakistan. YO is in fact referred to as Africa in Texas. Private herds and powerful advantages over public government parks. Whereas parks such as Yellowstone struggled to keep poachers out, private reserves enthusiastically welcomed hunters and their fees. By the 20th century, hunters created such a demand for buffalo that it became a small industry, and finally, public parks acceded to the demand for hunting, allowing shooters to pay $200 each for a buffalo. Yet the market also permitted people to engage in charity. Both the American Bison Society and the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, SPCA, ran important education programs to explain the need to the public to replenish the herds. Nevertheless, the buffalo's chief attraction was not in its noble beauty, but its exotic tasting meat. By the 1990s, more than 90% of the bison in North America were in private hands. Eisenberg notes that they were, quote, preserved not for their iconic significance in the interest of biological diversity, but simply raised to be slaughtered for their meat, end quote. For an animal nearly extinct at one point, it was an amazing turnaround that by the year 2000, more animals were raised on private reserves strictly for their meat than even existed in all the government parks and public zoos put together. When it comes to the bison, left-wing scholars have buffaloed American school children. And that's the end of that one. The next one is it's another barely 3-pager, so we'll go ahead and read that one. So this is lie number 34. I did not know that the Plains Indians were not buffalo hunters before they got horses. I had no idea that they were more sedentary, or, well, sedentary isn't the right word, but you know what I mean. I had no idea. I'll have to look that up. All right, lie number 34. The first Thanksgiving took place because the Indians saved the Puritans from their own ineptitude. There's one quote to start it off. The Wampanoag were actually invited to that Thanksgiving feast for the purpose of negotiating a treaty that would secure the lands of the Plymouth plantation for the Pilgrims. It should also be noted that the Indians, possibly out of a sense of charity toward their hosts, ended up bringing the majority of the food for the feast. That's by Chuck Larson, Introduction for Teachers, Tacoma Public Schools, 1987. There were, of course, numerous Thanksgivings, even before the Puritans arrived in America. Spaniards under Francisco Coronado held a Thanksgiving feast in 1541 to celebrate finding food and water in Florida, and another Thanksgiving celebration occurred in 1564 among the Huguenot colonists near modern-day Jacksonville. English Thanksgivings had already occurred in 1607 when George Popham and Abenaki Indians along the Kennebec River had a feast before the English abandoned the fort. Berkeley Plantation in Virginia had a Thanksgiving in 1619. The charter of the plantation states, quote, "We ordain that the day of our ship's arrival at the place assigned for plantation in the land of Virginia shall be yearly and perpetually kept holy as a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God." End quote. The date of December 4th, 1619 was established as the day of Thanksgiving, while a harvest festival was common in England at this time of year. What Berkeley Plantation celebrated was strictly a religious observance to thank God for the settlers' safe passage to the New World. Subsequently, Thanksgivings were held in each of the next 2 years before the small colony was wiped out. A much different set of circumstances greeted the Mayflower's Pilgrim settlers. The London investors wanted to control their capital, stipulating that at the end of 7 years, everything would be divided equally between the colonists and the merchants. Settlers were to work for the company, although they were allowed to work 2 days a week on what were called private, plots of land. Of course, the merchants realized the Pilgrims would work harder on their own land than for the company. Therefore, all wealth was to be put in a common pool, although the agents for the Pilgrims used arguments, quote, calculated to appeal to Christians in order to justify his acceptance of unpopular terms, end quote. The Pilgrims accepted the arrangement because they had little choice. Once they reached the New World, however, the settlers found the communal system only produced want and lack. It's important to recognize that the colonists arrived too late to plant and were already into the colder temperatures when they began to build houses. Of the Mayflower's 102 Pilgrims who arrived at Plymouth Rock, only 46 remained alive by the following spring. Among the dead was Dorothy, the wife of William Bradford, the leader of the Plymouth colony. The following spring they had hunted and fished without any instruction from the Indians and laid in barely enough provisions. Bradford reviewed the philosophy behind the original communal system. Quote, "The experience we had in this common course and condition was that, by taking away property and bringing community into a common wealth, it would make them happy and flourishing as if they were wiser than God." End quote. Of course, like V.I. Lenin and Mikhail Gorbachev, the Pilgrims found communism didn't work. Bradford described the reality, quote, "For young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they would spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without any recompense. That was thought injustice." End quote. Although Bradford ordered no want all summer, and there was a small harvest of corn and other vegetables, plus a great store of wild turkeys and venison, these stores declined throughout the winter. Still, the Pilgrims depended on supply ships arriving. Bradford recognized the communal system didn't work. Quote, "At length, after much debate of things, the governor, with the advice of the chiefest among them, gave way that they should set corn for every man for his own particular, and in that regard trust to themselves, in all other things to go in the general way as before, and so assign to every family a parcel of land according to the proportion of their number." End quote. With that, Plymouth was converted to a capitalist system. Bradford assigned individual land for each family to work and manage. Excuse me. It is true that Squanto, an English-speaking Wampanoag Indian whom the Pilgrims met in 1620, introduced the settlers to North American vegetables and provided other skills, although it is silly to think that the Pilgrims didn't know how to hunt, fish, and build houses. Most of what they received from the Indians came in the form of barter, with the settlers using items brought from their ships to trade. Even in this, leftist historians misrepresent the exchange, making it appear that Indians gave up massive amounts of land for a few trinkets. But in fact, those trinkets were manufactured items that the Indians had never seen, which they obtained for land they thought no one could truly own. Sometime in September 1621, after the abundant crops came in, the Pilgrims decided to thank God, not the Indians, inviting Squanto and Chief Massasoit to bring their immediate families, which amounted to more than 80 people. A 3-day feast, not initially called Thanksgiving, ensued as described by Edward Winslow's December 11, 1621 letter. 2 years later, Bradford issued the first official Thanksgiving proclamation, and this is a quote of the proclamation. Quote, "Inasmuch as the Great Father has given us this year an abundant harvest of Indian corn, wheat, peas, beans, squashes, and garden vegetables, and has made the forest to abound with game, and the sea with fish and clams, and inasmuch as he has protected us from the ravages of the savages, has spared us from pestilence and disease, has granted us freedom to worship God according to the dictates of our own conscience. Now I, your magistrate, do proclaim that all ye pilgrims, with your wives and ye little ones, do gather at ye meeting house on ye hill, between the hours of 9 and 12, in the day time on Thursday, November 29th, of the year of our Lord 1623, and the 3rd year since ye pilgrims landed on ye pilgrim rock, there to listen to ye pastor, and render thanksgiving to ye Almighty God for all his blessings." End quote. Soon they had a regular surplus, which they used to save the Indians who had now suffered from a poor growing season. Again, Bradford set aside a day of Thanksgiving, and again Massasoit and his family joined the Pilgrims. Good Indian-white relations would not last long. King Philip's War pitted the former Pilgrims against Wampanoags, and not surprisingly, when the English won in June 1676, they held another day of Thanksgiving to, quote, "praise God for such his goodness and favor." End quote. And that is the end of that one. And we've been going just over an hour. Starting to feel it in the throat, so I'm going to call it there. But that was 4 more, so we're up to number 35 out of 48, so we'll read 35, 6, 7, and 8 next time. And just so you know what's coming up, we have the robber barons pillaged the land and destroyed the environment. 36 is federal regulations have protected the public's health by identifying harmful products. 37 is global warming is a fact, and it's a man-made American-driven problem. Ha! We know that one's a bullshit, even though they're pushing it. And the next one is that 38 is the Constitution was the creation of elites protecting their financial interests. That should be interesting. But those will be the 4 for next time. And we're coming down to it. So we should be done with this in, I'm going to say, 3, possibly 4 more readings, and we'll be done with this book. So after next time, I'll start putting out some polls to see what we want to read next. I'm kind of inclined toward a couple of books, so I may just make the decision myself, but I'll put out. I don't know. I'll decide between now and then. Let's see who's around doing what. We got Count BB. We got Vesper. Zeus has got a lot of people watching him lately. He's really doing good. That's why I haven't been rating him. Yeah, I think I'll just call it there. There's, yeah, I'm just going to call it there. So, I'll see you in the next one.
Don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take a picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind to get my better side. I wanna back, that's all you want. Me, I'm back, tryna get me free. Ink that I attacked you. That's just the false truth. No need to argue. Yeah, I'm happy. You'll find me when it's time to pay the bill. I find you there. There's more than me when it's time to pay the bill. I find you there. You'll find me when it's time to pay the bill. I find you there. I'm so scared my house cannot run from always be watched by a smile. Don't sit on privacy, static, probably haven't heard of it. To live a different life, just There's more than me when it's time to find the door. I find you there. don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take a picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind to get my better side. I wanna push you back, that's all you want. Me, I'm back, tryna get me framed. And I attacked you. That's just all true. No need to argue. And yeah, I'm happy. You'll find baby, when it's time to pay the bill. I find you there. There's more than me, baby, when it's time to go. I find you there. You'll find baby, when it's time to pay the bill. I find you there. I'm so scared, my house, so how can I run this? Always be watched by a smile, that's so sincere. My privacy, static, probably haven't heard of it. To live a different life, is catching cameras on Don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take a picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind to get my better side. I wanna push you back, that's all you want. Me, I'm back, tryna get me framed. And I attacked you. That's just all true. No need to argue. And yeah, I'm happy. You'll find baby, when it's time to pay the bill. I find you there. There's more than me, baby, when it's time to go. I find you so scared my house, so how can I from this? Always be watched by that's so sincere. Our privacy, the static, probably haven't heard of it. To lead to different life, just catch me, Don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take the picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind to get my better side. I wanna push you back, but that's all you want. Me, I'm back, tryna get me free. And I attacked you. That's all true. No need to argue. And yeah, I'm happy, you're fine. I find you there. There's more than baby, we're inside. I find you there. You're fine, baby, we're inside. I find you there. I'm so scared my house, so how can I from this? Always be watched by that's so sincere. Our privacy, the static, probably haven't heard of it. To lead to different life, just catch me, Don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take the picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind to get my better side. I wanna push you back, but that's all you want. Me, I'm back, tryna get me free. And I attacked you. That's all true. No need to argue. And yeah, I'm happy, you're fine, baby, I find you there. There's more than baby, we're inside. scared to leave my house, so I cannot run this. Always being watched by a man that's so considered our privacy. The static, probably haven't heard of it. To live a different life, just kept me coming Don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take a picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind, get my better side. I wanna push you back, but that's all you want. Me, I'm back. Tryna get me free. Tryna get me free. Yeah, I attacked you. That's all true. No need to argue. And yeah, I'm had enough. I'm so scared my house cannot run this. Always being watched by a man that's so considered our privacy. The static, probably haven't heard of it. To live a different life, just kept me coming Don't like the lights, but it's camera time. Said take a picture, but you rolled your eyes. Now I'm mortified, and still terrorized. Push me behind, get my better side. I wanna push you back, but that's all you